The sun hung low over the western horizon like a copper coin balanced on the edge of the world. The stagecoach rocked and swayed along the dusty road that cut through the barren landscape between Silver Ridge and Cottonwood Springs, a journey that would take the better part of 2 days if the weather held and the horses stayed strong. Inside the coach, 5 passengers sat in uncomfortable proximity, their bodies jostling against one another with every rut and stone the wheels found beneath them. There was a woman in her middle years, dressed in black, traveling clothes that had seen better days, her face partially obscured by a veil she kept pulled low. She held a small leather case on her lap with both hands, her knuckles white from the grip she maintained even as she appeared to doze. Across from her sat a young man who couldn't have been more than 20, his face still soft with youth, but his eyes carrying a hardness that suggested he'd seen more of life than his years should have allowed. He wore a coat too large for his frame and boots that were scuffed nearly white from desert travel. Beside the young man was an older gentleman with silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard, the kind of man who looked like he might have been someone important once, perhaps a banker or a lawyer in one of the larger towns. He carried himself with a dignity that the cramped quarters couldn't quite diminish, though sweat beaded on his forehead and his collar had grown damp in the afternoon heat. Next to him, pressed against the far wall of the coach, was a Mexican woman with braided hair and calloused hands, her simple cotton dress speaking of hard work and humble means. She kept her eyes downcast most of the time, occasionally glancing out the window at the passing landscape. The 5th passenger was a man in his 30s with a weathered face and restless eyes that constantly scanned his fellow travelers and the world beyond the windows. He wore clothes that were neither fine nor ragged, the kind of unremarkable garments that allowed a person to blend into most any crowd. His hands are never quite still, always fidgeting with his hat or adjusting his position or brushing dust from his trousers. The driver and the guard sat up top, visible only as shifting shadows against the bright sky when the passengers looked up through the windows. The driver was a man named Hutchins who'd been running this route for 6 years and knew every mile of it like he knew the lines on his own palms. The guard was younger, a replacement for the regular man who'd taken sick in Silver Ridge. His name was Donovan, and this was only his 3rd run. What none of the passengers knew, what Hutchins and Donovan couldn't have suspected, was that 3 miles ahead, where the road curved around a formation of red rocks that rose from the desert floor like the broken teeth of some buried giant, for men waited in the failing light. They'd been there since mid-afternoon, taking turns watching the road, sharing water from canteens that were running low, and going over the plan one more time in whispered conversations. The leader of these 4 was a man called Virgil Kane, though that probably wasn't the name he'd been born with. He was tall and lean, with a face that might have been handsome if not for the hardness around his mouth and the coldness in his pale eyes. He'd spent the last 8 years moving through the territories, always one step ahead of the law, always looking for the next opportunity. He learned early that violence brought attention, that the smart play was to control a situation through fear and numbers and careful planning. A man didn't need to hurt anyone if he made them believe he would. The others with him were bound to him by circumstance and necessity rather than loyalty. There was Frank Hollister, a broad-shouldered man with a perpetually nervous disposition who'd fallen into outlawry after losing his ranch to debt and bad luck. There was a kid they called simply Dutch, though he wasn't Dutch at all, just a boy of 17 who'd run away from an orphanage in Kansas and found himself with nowhere else to go. And there was Samuel Prieto, a quiet man with knowing eyes who spoke rarely, but seemed to understand things the others missed. Virgil had gotten word 3 weeks earlier about a shipment moving from Silver Ridge to Cottonwood Springs. The information had come from a woman he knew in Silver Ridge who worked at the assay office and had access to records she shouldn't have been looking at. She'd told him about a sealed shipment being transported by private coach, paperwork that indicated it was valuable enough to warrant discretion, but not so valuable as to merit heavy guard. The timing seemed perfect, the route predictable, the risk manageable. What Virgil hadn't counted on, what his informant either didn't know or failed to mention, was that the shipment had been delayed by 2 days and would be traveling on a different coach entirely. The stagecoach approaching their position carried no such treasure. It carried only the 5 passengers and their personal belongings, the mail pouch locked in the rear boot, and perhaps $300 in fair money that Hutchins kept in a strongbox under his seat. But Virgil didn't know this yet. He was watching the road, listening for the sound of hoofbeats and rattling wheels, mentally rehearsing the words he would use and the tone he would employ. Everything depended on the first 60 seconds. If he could establish control immediately, make the driver and guard understand that resistance would be futile, then the rest would follow smoothly. Fear was the great equalizer. A man who believed himself outmatched would surrender things he might otherwise fight to protect. The sound reached them before the sight did. The rhythmic thunder of horses at full trot and the creaking protest of the coach body swaying behind them. Virgil stood from where he'd been crouching, and the others rose with him, taking the positions they discussed. Frank moved to one side of the road, Dutch to the other. Samuel stayed back, his role to watch for unexpected complications. Virgil himself stood directly in the center of the road, visible and unmistakable, his arms raised in a gesture that was both greeting and command. Inside the coach, the woman in black was the first to notice something was wrong. Her eyes, which had been closed, opened suddenly and fixed on the window. The restless man saw her reaction and turned to look as well, and within seconds, all 5 passengers were craning to see what lay ahead. The young man with the hard eyes spoke first, his voice tight. Someone in the road. The older gentleman leaned forward, squinting. Perhaps someone in need of assistance. Out here, the restless man said. Not likely. The Mexican woman crossed herself and began to pray in Spanish. Her words too quiet for the others to hear clearly, but the intent unmistakable. The woman in black tightened her grip on the leather case and said nothing at all. Up top, Hutchins saw the man in the road and felt his stomach drop. He'd been robbed twice before, both times years ago, and he knew the setup when he saw it. But he also knew that stopping was often safer than trying to run. A smart robber wanted your cooperation, not your life. A scared robber was dangerous. The key was to read the situation quickly and make the choice that kept everyone breathing. He pulled back on the reins, calling to the horses in a voice that was firm but not panicked. Steady now, steady. You should do exactly what I tell you if you want to see tomorrow. Hutchins interrupted, his voice hard now. These men don't want to fight. They want what we're carrying, and then they want to disappear. We give them that, and we go home tonight. The coach slowed, the wheels crunching over loose stones, and came to a halt about 20 feet from where Virgil stood. The dust that had been following them caught up and drifted past in a thin cloud that turned gold in the slanting light. Virgil walked forward slowly, his hands still partially raised, his face arranged in an expression that was meant to be reassuring but came across as merely cold. Good evening, gentlemen. He called up to Hutchins and Donovan. I apologize for the inconvenience, but I'm going to need you to cooperate with me for the next few minutes. Hutchins nodded slowly. We're not looking for trouble. Neither am I, Virgil said. Trouble is expensive and messy and generally not worth the effort. So here's how this is going to work. You and your friend, they're going to climb down from that seat nice and slow. You're going to help me with that strong box you've got up there. Then we're going to have your passengers step out and show us what they're carrying. If everyone does exactly what I ask, nobody gets hurt and you'll be on your way within 10 minutes. Inside the coach, the passengers heard every word. The young man with the hard eyes had gone very still, his jaw clenched. The older gentleman had closed his eyes and was breathing deeply through his nose. The restless man was looking from face to face as if searching for some indication of what to do. The Mexican woman continued her prayers. The woman in black stared straight ahead, her hands so tight on the leather case that her arms trembled. We should give them whatever they want, the older gentleman said quietly. Material possessions can be replaced. Lives cannot. Speak for yourself, the young man said. Maybe you've got nothing worth keeping, but some of us are smart enough to know when we're beaten, the restless man interrupted. Look around. You see how many of them there are? You see any way out of this that ends with us keeping our belongings and our health? The young man didn't answer, but his expression made his feelings clear. Outside, Hutchins was climbing down from the driver's seat, moving with the careful deliberation of a man who knew he was being watched. Donovan followed, his face pale, his movements jerky with fear. Virgil watched them with the patience of someone who'd done this before, noting the guard's nervousness and filing it away as potentially useful. "Frank," Virgil called without turning his head. "Come help me with this strongbox." "Dutch, watch the passengers." "Samuel, keep your eyes on the road." Frank moved forward from his position and climbed up onto the driver's seat, his weight making the whole coach rock slightly. The strongbox was locked, as expected, and Hutchins produced the key from his vest pocket without being asked. The box opened with a click that seemed loud in the desert quiet. Inside were 3 cloth bags, each containing coins and a few folded bills. Frank handed them down to Virgil one at a time, and Virgil weighed each in his hand with an expression that grew progressively more disappointed. This wasn't even close to what he'd been expecting. This was passenger fare and mail money, the kind of petty cash that wouldn't keep 4 men fed for more than a few weeks. But he kept his face neutral and turned his attention to the coach itself. "All right," he called. "Passengers out. One at a time." Slowly, the door opened and the older gentleman emerged first, moving stiffly, his hands held away from his body. He stepped down onto the road and stood where Virgil indicated, his dignity intact despite the circumstances. The Mexican woman came next, her eyes downcast, her hands clasped before her. Then the restless man, who couldn't quite meet anyone's gaze. Then the young man with the hard eyes, who looked like he wanted to say something but thought better of it. Last came the woman in black, still clutching the leather case. She stepped down carefully, her veil still in place, and stood slightly apart from the others. Virgil looked at each of them in turn, making quick assessments. The old man probably had a decent wallet. The young man might have some traveling money. The restless man looked like he'd already spent whatever he'd started with. The Mexican woman likely had almost nothing. But the woman in black, the one with the case she wouldn't let go of, that was interesting. "I'm going to need you all to empty your pockets and place whatever you're carrying on the ground in front of you," Virgil said, his voice calm and reasonable. "Wallets, jewelry, anything of value. This doesn't have to be difficult." The older gentleman reached into his coat and withdrew a leather wallet, placing it on the ground with a care that suggested it meant something to him beyond its monetary value. The young man followed suit, though his wallet was thinner, and he added a pocket watch that looked like it might have been his father's. The restless man produced a few crumpled bills and some loose change. The Mexican woman shook her head, showing empty hands. The woman in black didn't move. Virgil's eyes narrowed slightly. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to cooperate." "I have nothing for you," she said, her voice muffled by the veil but steady. "That case you're holding suggests otherwise. This is personal. It has no value to anyone but me." Virgil took a step closer, and Dutch moved in from the side, creating a sense of enclosure. "I'll be the judge of what has value. Put it on the ground." "No." The word hung in the air like a challenge. Hutchins, still standing off to the side, felt his chest tighten. This was how things went wrong. This was how a simple robbery turned into something nobody could take back. "Ma'am," he said, his voice careful. "Please, just do what he asks." She turned her veiled face toward him. "You don't understand. I can't." "You can," Virgil said, his patience beginning to fray. "You just don't want to. But I'm not asking anymore." He reached for the case, and she jerked it away, stumbling backward. Dutch moved to grab her arm, and she twisted away from him, and suddenly the old man was stepping forward, placing himself between them. "Leave her alone," he said, his voice stronger than Virgil would have expected. "Can't you see she's frightened?" "I can see she's being foolish," Virgil said, "and I can see you're about to make the same mistake." "Step back." "Or what?" the young man said, and now he was moving too, positioning himself beside the old man. "What exactly are you going to do to all of us?" It was a good question, and it struck at the heart of Virgil's strategy. He'd built his approach on the assumption of compliance, on the belief that fear alone would be sufficient. But fear only worked if people believed in the threat, and the young man's question had planted a seed of doubt. What would they do? Could 4 men really control 5 passengers and 2 coach employees if everyone decided to resist at once? The restless man seemed to be thinking the same thing. He straightened slightly, no longer avoiding eye contact. The Mexican woman stopped praying and looked up, her eyes moving from Virgil to Frank to Dutch to Samuel. Even Donovan, the nervous young guard, seemed to be reconsidering his position. Virgil could feel the situation slipping away from him, could sense the shift in the air. He'd seen it happen before, that moment when the prey realized the predator was just another animal, vulnerable and mortal. He needed to reassert control immediately, but he'd built his entire approach around not escalating to violence. That had always been his edge, the thing that made him different from the reckless criminals who ended up shot or hanged. But now it was becoming a liability. "Frank," he said quietly, "come here." Frank moved to his side, and Virgil leaned in close, speaking in a voice too low for the others to hear. "This isn't what we planned for. I know. We don't have anything to back up our threats. I know that too. So what do we do?" Frank looked at the passengers, at the growing defiance in their postures, at the woman in black still clutching her case. "We could leave. Just take what we got and go. That's less than $100 split 4 ways. Better than nothing. Better than this turning into something worse." Virgil wanted to argue, wanted to find a way to salvage the situation, but he could see the logic in Frank's words. They'd lost the psychological advantage. Pushing further would only invite resistance, and resistance could lead to outcomes nobody wanted. The smart play was to cut losses and disappear. But then Samuel spoke from his position watching the road, his voice carrying a note of urgency. "Riders coming." From the east. Everyone turned to look, and there in the distance, visible against the darkening sky, were 3 shapes on horseback moving fast along the road. Too fast to be casual travelers. Too purposeful to be anything but trouble. Hutchins felt his blood run cold. Law? Bounty hunters? Other outlaws? Any of those options could turn the situation from bad to catastrophic. Virgil made his decision in an instant. "We're done here. Move." He turned and ran for the rocks where they'd left their horses, Frank and Dutch following immediately. But Samuel hesitated, his eyes still on the approaching riders, trying to make out details in the failing light. That hesitation cost him. By the time he turned to follow the others, they'd already disappeared into the shadows of the rocks, and he was left exposed on the open road. The riders drew closer, and now Hutchins could make out details. 3 men, all well-armed, all wearing badges that caught the last rays of sunlight. Lawmen from Cottonwood Springs, probably responding to word of suspicious activity along the stage route. Samuel realized he couldn't reach the rocks without being seen. He stood frozen for a moment, caught between running and staying, between fight and flight. Then he made a choice that surprised everyone. He walked slowly toward the passengers, his hands raised, and spoke in his quiet voice. "I'm sorry," he said. "This wasn't supposed to go this way." The lead rider brought his horse to a stop 30 feet away, his eyes taking in the scene with professional efficiency. The driver and guard looking shaken but unharmed. The passengers clustered together, some of their belongings on the ground. One man, standing with his hands raised in a clear gesture of surrender. "Anyone hurt?" the lawman called. "No, sir," Hutchins answered. "We're all fine." "How many were there?" "4," the young man said before Hutchins could answer. 3 got away into those rocks. This one stayed behind. The lawman dismounted, his companions doing the same, and approached Samuel with caution. "That true? You part of this?" Samuel nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." "And your friends left you?" "Seems like it." One of the other lawmen was already heading toward the rocks, calling for the others to come out, promising they were surrounded and had nowhere to go. But Virgil, Frank, and Dutch were already riding hard to the north, following a narrow trail that would take them miles away before circling back toward civilization. They'd abandoned Samuel without a second thought, prioritizing their own escape over any notion of loyalty or honor. The lead lawman looked at Samuel with something that might have been pity. "You picked the wrong partners." "I picked the wrong life," Samuel said. "But I suppose it's too late for that now." As the lawman began securing Samuel's hands, the woman in black finally lowered the leather case she'd been clutching. The old man moved to her side, his voice gentle. "Are you all right?" She nodded, her hands shaking now that the danger had passed. "Thank you," she said, "for standing up." "We all stood up," the young man said, and there was something like wonder in his voice. "We all decided it at once, didn't we? That we weren't going to let them take what they wanted without question." The restless man laughed, a sound edged with hysteria. "I don't know what I was thinking. I've never done anything brave in my life." "Maybe you've never had reason to before," Hutchins said, climbing back up onto the driver's seat. "Sometimes you don't know what you're capable of until you're tested." The Mexican woman spoke for the first time since the ordeal began, her English accented but clear. "I think God was watching us today. God or luck or simple human stubbornness," the old man said. "Does it matter which? We're all still here." The lawmen finished securing Samuel and gathered up the money that Virgil had dropped when he fled. They returned the passengers' belongings and helped everyone back into the coach, promising to escort them the rest of the way to Cottonwood Springs. As they prepared to continue the journey, the lead lawman approached the driver's seat once more. "We got word someone might try for this stage," he said. "Had information about a shipment worth stealing. But from what I can see, there's nothing here but personal effects and fair money." Hutchins shook his head. "Then somebody fed those outlaws bad information. Or maybe the shipment they were after is on a different coach entirely." "Likely so. These things happen. Men make plans based on partial truths and end up with nothing but trouble." He paused, then added, "You handled this well. Keeping calm, not pushing for a fight. That probably saved lives today." After the lawman rode back to his position, Donovan leaned over and spoke quietly to Hutchins. "I wanted to fight. When it started, I wanted to go for..." He stopped himself, remembering the rules of this world where such things went unmentioned. "I wanted to resist immediately." "I know," Hutchins said. "I could see it on you. But resistance without thinking gets people killed. These passengers, they didn't resist blindly. They waited. They watched. They chose their moment based on reading the situation, not on fear or pride. That's why it worked." Inside the coach, the woman in black had finally removed her veil. Her face was younger than her clothing suggested, and tear tracks marked her cheeks. The leather case sat open on her lap now, revealing its contents to anyone who cared to look. Photographs, letters, a small Bible, a child's shoe, mementos of a life that had been, of people who were gone. "I couldn't let them take it," she said to no one in particular. "It's all I have left of them." The old man understood without needing explanation. "I lost my family to fever 3 years ago," he said. "I carry my wife's wedding ring on a chain around my neck. I would have fought too if it came to that." The young man was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "My father gave me that watch the day before he died. Told me to use it to make something of my life, to not waste my time the way he felt he'd wasted his." He shook his head. "I've been wasting it anyway. Drifting, looking for easy money and quick fortune. Maybe today was meant to remind me that some things are worth more than their weight in gold." The restless man looked at his hands. "I've spent my whole life avoiding confrontation, backing down, running away. I told myself it was wisdom, that discretion was the better part of valor. But today I stood with strangers and refused to give in to fear, and it felt like the first honest thing I've done in years." The Mexican woman smiled slightly. "My mother always said that God puts us where we need to be, with the people we need to meet. Perhaps we were all meant to be on this coach today. Perhaps we were meant to learn this lesson together." As night fell completely and the coach continued its journey under the escort of the 3 lawmen, the landscape transformed into a realm of shadows and stars. The temperature dropped sharply, as it always did in the desert after sundown, and the passengers huddled closer together for warmth, the earlier tension replaced by a strange sense of camaraderie. Miles to the north, Virgil, Frank, and Dutch made camp in a dry wash, their horses tied to scrub brush, their mood dark and bitter. They'd counted the money from the strongbox, $83 and change. Divided 3 ways, it was barely enough to justify the risk they'd taken, certainly nothing close to the fortune they'd been expecting. "Your source was wrong," Frank said, not for the first time. Virgil didn't respond. He was thinking about the moment when everything had shifted when the passengers had stopped being victims and started being obstacles. He'd read it wrong. He'd assumed they would value their lives over their possessions, and in a sense they had. But he'd failed to account for the fact that some possessions represented more than monetary value, that some things were worth defending even at personal risk. "We should have taken the woman's case," Dutch said. "Whatever was in it, she was willing to fight for it. Must have been valuable." "Or it was what she said," Frank replied. "Personal, worthless to anyone but her. Still should have checked, and done it when she refused." Frank's voice rose slightly. "What exactly would you have done, boy? You gonna hurt her to get it? You going to—" He stopped himself, aware of the boundary they never crossed in words. "We don't do that. That's the line we don't cross. Maybe that's why we're sitting here with pocket change while real outlaws are getting rich," Dutch said bitterly. "Real outlaws end up dead or in prison," Virgil said, speaking for the first time. "We've stayed free this long because we're smart, because we know when to push and when to walk away. We walked away with nothing. We walked away alive and free. Samuel didn't. That silenced them. Samuel, who'd been with them for 6 months, who'd never said much but had always been reliable, was now in the custody of the law. He'd face trial, probably spend years in prison, and they'd left him without a backward glance, because that's what survival required. "You think he'll talk?" Frank asked. "About what?" "He doesn't know where we're from or where we're going. He knows our names, but those aren't real anyway. He's got nothing to give them that they don't already have. Still, he might try, might bargain for a lighter sentence. Let him try. We'll be long gone before it matters." They fell in a silence, each man alone with his thoughts. The fire they'd built was small and smokeless, meant for warmth rather than cooking, since they had nothing to cook. They'd eat dried meat and hardtack, drink water that tasted of minerals and desert dust, and sleep on hard ground under hard stars. Tomorrow they'd ride for the nearest town, split the money, and go their separate ways. The partnership was over. The grand plan had failed. All that remained was the slow, grinding work of survival. Back on the road to Cottonwood Springs, the stagecoach rolled through the darkness, the escort of lawmen riding in formation around it. Inside, the passengers had fallen into a comfortable quiet, the kind that comes after shared crisis, when words seem less important than simple presence. The woman in black had repacked her leather case and closed it, but her grip had loosened. She no longer held it like it might be torn away at any moment. The old man had dozed off with his chin on his chest, snoring softly. The young man stared out the window at the stars, his father's watch in his hand, turning it over and over. The restless man had finally stopped fidgeting, his hands still in his lap. The Mexican woman prayed again, but this time it sounded like gratitude rather than desperation. Hutchins and Donovan maintained their positions up top, saying little, each processing the day's events in his own way. Hutchins had seen enough of life to know that today could have gone very differently. A different set of outlaws, a different set of passengers, a different convergence of circumstances, and they might be looking at injury or worse. But the pieces had fallen in a particular pattern, people had made particular choices, and the outcome had been resolution rather than tragedy. Donovan was learning something about fear and courage, about the difference between reckless bravery and calculated resistance. He'd wanted to react immediately, to meet aggression with aggression. But Hutchins had shown him that sometimes survival depended on patience, on reading situations, and choosing responses based on reality rather than emotion. The passengers had shown him that ordinary people could find extraordinary strength when necessary, that unity and resolve could overcome advantage of numbers and position. In Cottonwood Springs, word of the attempted robbery had already spread. The lawman had sent a rider ahead with news, and by the time the coach arrived at the station, a small crowd had gathered. People wanted to see the passengers who'd stood up to outlaws. They wanted to hear the story, to measure it against their own fears and fantasies. But the passengers themselves were subdued as they climbed down from the coach. They were tired and dusty, stiff from hours of travel, ready for hot food in soft beds. They didn't feel like heroes. They felt like people who'd been frightened and had responded as best they could in the moment, without time for reflection or doubt. The woman in black was met by a man who'd been waiting for her, presumably family or a friend. He took her case gently and led her away. Asking quiet questions, she answered with nods and shakes of her head. The old man collected his wallet from where the lawmen had been holding it for safekeeping, checked to ensure everything was there, and walked alone toward the hotel. The young man stood for a moment in the street, looking at his father's watch one more time before putting it in his pocket and turning toward the telegraph office. The restless man simply disappeared into the crowd, anonymous once more. The Mexican woman knelt in the dust and kissed a small cross she wore around her neck before rising and walking toward the church at the end of the street. Hutchins helped secure the horses and made his report to the station manager, downplaying the danger, emphasizing that everyone had acted professionally and no one had been hurt. Donovan stood nearby, learning how these things were discussed, how language could shape perception of events. The lead lawman found them before they finished. "We'll hold the prisoner here overnight, then transport him to the territorial capital for trial. Your testimony will be needed, both of you, and probably some of the passengers as well." Hutchins nodded. "We'll be available." "Good. For what it's worth, you handled that situation as well as anyone could have hoped. You didn't let pride or fear dictate your actions. That takes experience and judgment." After the lawman left, Hutchins and Donovan walked together toward the boarding house where they'd spend the night before making the return journey to Silver Ridge. The streets of Cottonwood Springs were quieter now, the excitement of the coach's arrival fading into the normal rhythms of evening in a small desert town. "Can I ask you something?" Donovan said as they walked. "Of course. When they first stopped us, when you decided to cooperate, were you afraid?" Hutchins considered the question. "Yes. Fear is the natural response to danger. But fear doesn't have to control you. Fear is information. It tells you that something matters, that caution is warranted. What you do with that information is what defines the outcome." The passengers, when they decided to resist, was that courage or foolishness? Both, maybe, or neither. It was human beings reaching a point where surrender felt worse than resistance. They'd already lost control of their journey, their safety, their sense of security. When they were asked to give up things that represented more than money or possessions, something in them said no. That's not courage or foolishness. That's just the line where compliance ends and resistance begins. And that line is different for every person. They reached the boarding house and went inside, the warmth and light a stark contrast to the cold desert night. Later, after they'd eaten and washed and prepared for sleep, Donovan lay in his narrow bed thinking about the day's events, replaying them in his mind, examining his own reactions and decisions. He thought about Samuel, the quiet outlaw who'd surrendered without fight, who sat now in a jail cell awaiting whatever justice the territory would impose. He wondered what had brought a man to that point, what series of choices and circumstances had led him to stand on a desert road, trying to steal from strangers. And he wondered if Samuel had ever imagined it would end this way, abandoned by his partners, caught by the law, facing years behind bars for a crime that had netted nothing. He thought about Virgil and Frank and Dutch, wherever they were now, counting their meager take, and probably arguing about whose fault it was. They'd live to rob another day, most likely. They'd plan another job, gather information, pick another target. And maybe next time they'd succeed. Or maybe next time the circumstances would be even worse, the resistance even stronger, the consequences even more severe. He thought about the woman in black and her leather case full of memories, about the old man and his wedding ring, about the young man and his father's watch. He thought about how easy it would have been for any of them to simply hand over their possessions, and how much harder it had been to stand firm. And he realized that what had happened today wasn't really about the money or the jewelry or even the robbery itself. It was about the moment when people decided what they were willing to lose and what they were willing to fight for. In another part of town, in a hotel room with clean sheets and a window that looked out onto the main street, the old man sat in a chair and held the chain with his wife's ring, letting it catch the lamplight. He'd come very close to losing it today. If the situation had played out differently, if the passengers hadn't united in their resistance, if the lawmen hadn't arrived when they did, The ring might now be in Virgil's pocket or lying in the dust of the desert road. But it wasn't. It was here, solid and real, still carrying the warmth of his body and the weight of his memories. Tomorrow he'd continue his journey to wherever he was going, carrying this small piece of his past with him. And he'd carry, too, the memory of standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers, of finding in himself a capacity for resistance he hadn't known he possessed. In the church at the end of the street, the Mexican woman lit a candle and knelt before it, her lips moving in prayer. She thanked God for protection, for deliverance, for the courage of strangers and the kindness of fellow travelers. She prayed for Samuel, the outlaw who'd been left behind, asking for mercy and redemption even for those who'd meant harm. She prayed for her own journey to continue safely, for the family waiting for her 2 days' travel to the west. And she prayed that she would remember this day not as a day of fear, but as a day when ordinary people had found extraordinary strength, when the weak had stood against the strong and prevailed not through violence, but through simple refusal to yield. In the jail, Samuel sat on a hard bench in a cell that smelled of old sweat and newer desperation. He'd been given water and a blanket, told that someone would bring food later. The lawmen had asked him questions he'd answered honestly, not seeing any point in lies now that his fate was sealed. He told them about Virgil and Frank and Dutch, described them as best he could, gave the names he knew even though those names were probably false. He'd told them about the plan, about the information Virgil had received, about the shipment they'd expected to find. And when the lawman had shaken his head and explained that the valuable shipment had been delayed and rerouted, Samuel had felt something that might have been relief. At least they hadn't failed through their own incompetence. They'd failed because the information was wrong, because circumstances had shifted in ways they couldn't have anticipated. But that didn't change where he was now. It didn't change the fact that he'd chosen this path, had continued choosing it even when opportunities to turn back had presented themselves. He told himself he had no other options, that a man with his past and his limitations couldn't make an honest living. But sitting in this cell, facing years of imprisonment, he wondered if that had been true or just an excuse, a way to avoid the harder work of building something legitimate. He thought about the passengers, about their faces when they'd realized what was happening, about the fear that had transformed into defiance. He thought about the woman with her leather case, the old man stepping forward to protect her, the young man questioning what they would do. Those people had made choices too in that moment. They'd chosen unity over isolation, resistance over submission, and their choices had led to freedom while his had led to this cell. Tomorrow he'd be transported to the territorial capital. There would be a trial, though the outcome was hardly in doubt. He'd been caught in the act, had confessed readily. The judge would impose a sentence measured in years, and he'd spend those years in a place that would make this cell seem comfortable by comparison. And when he finally emerged, if he survived that long, he'd be a different man. Older, harder, marked forever by his choices and their consequences. But for tonight, in this small jail in Cottonwood Springs, he had time to think, to reflect, to consider the paths his life might have taken if different choices had been made at critical junctures. And he found himself hoping, in a way he hadn't hoped for anything in a long time, that wherever Virgil and Frank and Dutch ended up, they would make better choices than he had, that they would find some way to step off this path before it led them to cells of their own. Out in the desert, in the dry wash where the 3 remaining outlaws had made camp, the fire had burned down to embers. Frank slept fitfully, troubled by dreams he wouldn't remember. Dutch lay on his back staring at the stars, wondering if this life was really what he wanted or just what he'd fallen into through accident and circumstance. And Virgil sat watch, his eyes on the darkness beyond the firelight, his mind turning over the day's failures and calculating what came next. He'd been doing this for 8 years, moving from town to town, job to job, always staying ahead of the law, always looking for the next opportunity. And in all that time, he'd accumulated nothing. No home, no relationships, no security. Just a string of temporary successes and permanent risks. A life lived in the margins and the shadows. Today's failure stung, not because of the money they'd missed, but because it had revealed a flaw in his approach. He'd built his strategy around psychological control, around making people believe in threats he never intended to carry out. But the passengers had seen through it. They'd recognized that his bark had no bite, that his power was illusory. And once they'd seen that, his control had evaporated like water on hot sand. What did that mean for the future? Could he continue operating this way, relying on bluff and intimidation? Or did today mark the beginning of diminishing returns, the point where his methods would no longer be effective? He didn't know, and not knowing troubled him more than the poverty in his pockets or the loneliness in his heart. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in shades of purple and gold, the world began to stir. In Cottonwood Springs, the woman in black woke in a comfortable bed, her leather case on the table beside her, and felt the first real peace she'd known in months. The old man rose and dressed carefully, preparing to continue his journey with a renewed sense of purpose. The young man sent a telegraph message to someone he hadn't spoken to in years, using words that came easier than he'd expected. The restless man found work loading freight wagons, physical labor that felt honest in a way his previous occupations never had. The Mexican woman attended early mass and lit another candle before setting out on the final leg of her journey. Hutchins and Donovan hitched fresh horses to the stage and prepared for the return trip to Silver Ridge, carrying mail and freight, but no passengers this time. As they rolled out of town, Donovan looked back at the place where so much had happened in such a short time, where ordinary people had proven themselves extraordinary, and where his own understanding of courage and fear had been fundamentally altered. "You think those outlaws will try again?" he asked Hutchins. "Probably. Men like that don't usually stop until they're stopped." "And Samuel? What do you think will happen to him?" "Prison, certainly. Maybe 5 years, maybe 10. Depends on the judge and whether this is his first offense." Hutchins paused, then added, "Some men come out of prison better than they went in. They use the time to think, to change, to find a different path. Some come out worse, and some don't come out at all. Which kind do you think he is?" "I think he's the kind who knows he made mistakes and regrets them. Whether that's enough to change his future, I can't say. That's up to him." They rode in silence for a while, the morning sun warming the desert air, the road ahead clear and straight. Behind them, Cottonwood Springs shrank to a cluster of buildings and then disappeared entirely. Ahead, Silver Ridge waited, a full day's travel away, familiar and ordinary. In the territorial capital, in the weeks that followed, Samuel stood trial as expected. The courtroom was half empty, the proceedings perfunctory. The evidence was clear, the verdict predetermined. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, Samuel stood and spoke clearly. "I made choices that brought me here," he said. "I take responsibility for those choices. I won't ask for mercy I don't deserve. But I will say this. I'm grateful that no one was hurt by what we attempted to do. I'm grateful that the passengers on that coach found the courage to resist us, because if they hadn't, I might still be out there making the same mistakes, heading toward an even worse end. Sometimes the greatest kindness is being stopped before you do irreparable harm." The judge seemed surprised by this response, but recovered quickly and imposed a sentence of 7 years in the territorial prison. Samuel accepted it with a nod and was led away in shackles, disappearing into the system that would hold him for the foreseeable future. The passengers testified when called, each providing their account of what had happened. The woman in black spoke of her fear and her refusal to surrender what mattered most. The old man described the moment when he decided to stand between the outlaws and violence. The young man explained how unity had emerged from shared crisis. Their words were recorded in court documents that would eventually gather dust in some archive, but the impact of their testimony went beyond legal proceedings. They were recounting not just an attempted robbery, but a moment of collective transformation, when fear had been transmuted into strength through human connection. Months later, in different parts of the territory, the principals of this story continued their separate journeys. The woman in black had reached her destination and found a measure of peace, her leather case now sitting on a shelf in a small house where she could see it every day. The old man had completed his business and returned to a home that felt less empty than before, carrying with him the memory of standing for something that mattered. The young man had reconciled with family he'd been estranged from, his father's watch now a bridge between past and future rather than a weight of unfulfilled obligation. The restless man had discovered that honest work, while harder, brought satisfactions that easy money never could. The Mexican woman had been reunited with her children and told them stories of saints and miracles and ordinary people who became extraordinary in moments of crisis. Hutchins continued driving the stage between Silver Ridge and Cottonwood Springs, training Donovan and other young men in the art of reading situations and making choices that preserved life over pride. Donovan matured into his role, learning that true courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the management of it, wasn't reckless action, but thoughtful response. Virgil, Frank, and Dutch had split their minimal take and gone their separate ways, each pursuing whatever opportunities presented themselves in the vast and lawless territory. Dutch eventually found legitimate work on a ranch and left the outlaw life behind. Frank drifted from one failed scheme to another until he was caught during a bungled robbery in Arizona and sent to prison himself. Virgil simply disappeared, becoming one of those figures who drift through history, leaving no trace beyond scattered memories and unanswered questions. And the road between Silver Ridge and Cottonwood Springs continued to carry travelers through the desert landscape, each journey a collection of individual stories and private dramas, some momentous and some mundane. The rocks where the outlaws had waited still stood against the sky, weathering slowly under sun and wind, holding no memory of what had transpired there, but serving as mute witness to the endless procession of human hopes and fears and choices. In the end, what happened on that dusty road was neither unique nor unprecedented. Throughout history, people have been tested by circumstances they didn't choose, forced to make decisions in moments of crisis, surprised by their own capacity for courage or weakness. The attempted robbery failed, not because of superior force or clever planning, but because human beings, when pushed far enough, will defend what they value even at personal risk. The outlaws had made assumptions based on their experience, believing that fear would be sufficient to ensure compliance. But they failed to account for the fact that people are not predictable, that circumstances can create solidarity among strangers, that material possessions can represent intangible values worth defending. They'd planned for a simple transaction, threats exchanged for valuables, and encountered instead a complex human response that couldn't be controlled or coerced. The passengers had discovered something about themselves that day, something most people never learn because they're never tested in quite that way. They'd learned that they could stand firm when it mattered, that they could find strength in unity, that ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances could shape outcomes through choice rather than simply accepting whatever fate imposed on them. And perhaps that's the real story here, beyond the details of who did what and when. It's the story of human agency, of the power that comes from recognizing that we are not merely victims of circumstance, but participants in shaping our own fates. The outlaws had assumed agency only for themselves, treating their targets as passive objects to be manipulated. The passengers had asserted their own agency, refusing to accept the roles assigned to them in someone else's plan. In the great sweep of history, this incident would warrant barely a footnote. An attempted stagecoach robbery that failed, one outlaw captured, a modest amount of money recovered, no one seriously hurt. The newspapers of the time gave a paragraph or two before moving on to other stories. The official records reduced it to dates and names and sentences imposed. But for the people involved, it was a defining moment, a point where paths diverged and lives changed in ways both subtle and profound. The woman in black would always remember the weight of that leather case in her hands and the realization that some things are worth defending regardless of practical considerations. The old man would carry the memory of stepping forward when every instinct told him to step back, of choosing principle over safety. The young man would mark this as the day he stopped drifting and started moving with purpose. The restless man would see it as the moment he discovered that passivity and avoidance were choices rather than inevitabilities. The Mexican woman would speak of it as evidence of divine providence and human solidarity working in mysterious concert. For Samuel, sitting in his cell through the long years of imprisonment, it would be remembered as the last day of his freedom and the first day of his reckoning. For Virgil and the others, it would fade into the background noise of failed attempts and missed opportunities, just another job that didn't work out in a life full of such disappointments. And for us, hearing this story across the distance of years, what lesson might we draw? Perhaps simply this, that in moments of crisis, we are capable of more than we imagine, that unity with strangers can be as powerful as division is destructive, that resistance to injustice doesn't always require violence or martyrdom, but sometimes just requires refusal, a simple no spoken with conviction. The sun that rose over the desert the morning after the attempted robbery looked exactly like the sun that had risen the day before. The rocks stood unchanged. The road stretched on toward distant horizons. But the people who had traveled that road were different now, carrying with them a story they would tell in various forms for the rest of their lives, each version slightly different, each emphasizing different details, but all circling back to the same central truth. When we are tested, we choose who we will be, and those choices, made in moments that pass quickly, echo through all the days that follow.